Hello, everyone. Tonight, I'm excited to share with you a thrilling ghost story by Min Lei titled The Devil's Tomb Next to the Temple. Now sit back and listen as I take you into the eerie world of this tale. The story begins with Hong, a skilled surgeon working at a well-known hospital in the city. But Hong wasn't just any doctor. People in the hospital called him the Strange Doctor. Why? Because Hong had an unusual appearance. He always wore an all-white outfit with buttons styled like a Chinese qipao. His long hair reached his back, and his beard stretched down to his knees. His eyes always glowed with intensity, and his loud voice often startled new patients who were terrified by his strange look. Not only did he look strange, but Hong also had a fiery temper. The hospital administration often told him to cut his hair and shave his beard, but he always found excuses not to. Yet no one could deny his skills. Hong was a master at acupuncture. Patients from everywhere, who had tried treatments elsewhere without success, came to Hong, and with his magical hands, they were cured. At first, people were scared of him, but over time, many grew to love him and saw him as part of their family. They even invited him to their homes for meals and gatherings, making him an essential part of their lives. Yesterday, after a long day at the hospital, Hong stopped by the house of an old patient, an elderly man named Fong, who had promised Hong a mysterious gift. As he arrived, Hong called out, "Mr. Fong, are you home?" Slowly, the old man hobbled out with his cane and shouted back, "I'm here. Just give me a moment to unlock the gate for you." Once inside, Hong and the old man disappeared into a room deep within the house. After a while, Hong came out with a black package in his arms, smiling with excitement. "Thank you so much for this priceless gift," he said to the old man, who, though a bit regretful, smiled warmly and replied, "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be healed. I wouldn't give this to anyone else, not even for gold." On the way home, Hong carefully placed the black package in his scooter's trunk, making sure to cover it with a raincoat so no one would see. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, he muttered to himself, "Good, no one saw." It was the first day of the 7th lunar month, the time when ghosts are believed to roam the world. Earlier that day, while taking a break, Hong scrolled through Facebook, seeing people wishing each other luck. His colleagues had warned him, "Be careful this month. Bad things happen, especially with severe patients." But Hong scoffed, brushing off their superstitions. To him, every day was the same, and he didn't believe in avoiding bad luck, not even during the 7th month. But perhaps he was wrong. Just after Hong had collected the mysterious gift from the old man, something horrifying was about to be revealed. When he arrived home, he saw his mother kneeling at the family altar, dressed in her Buddhist prayer robe. She was a devout Buddhist, especially during sacred days like this, often spending hours chanting. Seeing her like this, Hong couldn't help but smirk, thinking about how he could mess with her. While she was deep in prayer, he honked his scooter horn loudly, signaling her to open the gate. But his mother didn't even flinch, continuing her chanting and prayer as if nothing had happened. Annoyed, Hong got off his scooter, unlocked the gate himself, and walked into the house. He retrieved the black package from his trunk and carried it into the living room, which also served as his mother's prayer room. Seeing him, his mother glanced over but continued chanting as her prayers weren't yet complete. Frustrated, Hong walked over, placed the black package on her lap, and said in a serious but mischievous tone, "I've brought you a gift, Mom." His mother paused her chanting, cautiously holding the package. "What did you bring me?" she asked. Hong smirked. "Go ahead, open it. It's something special." Despite her hesitation, she started unwrapping the layers of plastic. But as she opened one layer, there was yet another underneath. Growing impatient, she muttered, "Why is this wrapped so tightly? What kind of gift is this?" Finally, after removing the last layer, his mother let out a terrified scream. "Oh my God! Help me, someone!" It was as if an electric shock had hit her. Mrs. Hui threw the woman's skull, with its long, tangled hair and eyes wide open in terror, across the room. Along with the skull, an old, worn U.S. Army cap flew out. She screamed in horror, shouting, "Blood! Where's all this blood coming from?" Seeing his mother in a panic, Hong burst into laughter. "Mom, what's wrong with you? Look closely." Hui curled up in the corner of the room, covering her face with her hands, too afraid to look. Watching her so terrified, Hong felt a bit guilty. He quickly ran over, picked up the skull and the cap and placed them back in front of her. He smoothed down the tangled hair and carefully placed the cap on the head again, then held it up to his mother. "Mom, open your eyes. It's just a mannequin head, not real. There's nothing to be afraid of." Mrs. Huet slowly opened her eyes, realizing it was just a plastic mannequin head with lifeless eyes. There was no blood. She let out a deep breath, relieved but still shaken. She glanced at the mannequin head briefly and waved her hand. "Take it away. Don't ever scare this old woman like that again, you ungrateful son." Seeing his mother looking exhausted, Hong suddenly felt worried. What if she had a heart attack? He had scared her once before, and her blood pressure spiked to 170, almost sending her to the emergency room. Yet despite that, this odd doctor hadn't learned his lesson, and still found joy in scaring people with these strange tricks. After placing the mannequin head back on the shelf, Hong tidied up the military collectibles scattered around the living room. Then, he headed to his bedroom to rest after a long night on call at the hospital. Downstairs, as Mrs. Huet recovered from the fright her son had given her, the steady sound of her chanting prayers filled the house once again. Hong had been working in medicine for 25 years, but his career had been anything but smooth. In the past, while working in the surgery department, he had a near-fatal accident during a delivery operation. He was in such a rush that the surgical knife accidentally nicked his hand. The patient was HIV positive, and for a moment, Hong thought his career and life might be over. Luckily, with medication, he avoided infection. Fearless and rebellious by nature, Hong wasn't afraid of anything. After that incident, he was transferred to the traditional medicine department. Alongside his medical career, Hong had a deep passion for collecting war memorabilia, especially military artifacts. He would often search far and wide to bring home the things he loved. But with his busy job and a house that was already too small, it wasn't long before Hong's home turned into a chaotic storage space filled with random, old items. Anyone who visited Hong's house would feel overwhelmed by the clutter and the eerie atmosphere. The only organized space was the family altar, which Mrs. Huet kept meticulously clean. The rest of the 3-story, 6-room house was packed with items Hong had collected. Old canteens from wartime, steel helmets, mortars, and vintage motorcycles like Vespa and Piaggio were scattered throughout the living room, up the stairs, and along the hallways. Whenever guests came by and admired his collection, Hong would beam with pride and could talk for hours about the history and value of each item. Meanwhile, Mrs. Huet would sigh, unsure how to clear out the endless clutter. Being a devoted Buddhist, Mrs. Huet had many friends who shared her faith. Every month, on the 1st and 15th days of the lunar calendar, her friends would come by to take her to the temple for prayers. Tonight was the first day of the month of the Ghost Festival, a major religious event. Normally, she wouldn't leave until around 6 p.m., but today her friends arrived earlier than usual to avoid traffic and in case it rained. As Mrs. Huet was busy packing her prayer robe into her bag, she heard a voice from the gate calling out, "Huet, are you home? Are you ready yet?" Hearing her friend's voice, Mrs. Huet quickly hurried to open the gate, calling out as she walked, "I'm coming, give me a moment." She opened the gate for her longtime friend, Mrs. Vun, who stepped inside and was immediately taken aback by the sheer amount of clutter in the house. Her eyes were quickly drawn to the mannequin head Hong had brought home that morning, sitting prominently on the bookshelf by the living room entrance. Meanwhile, Mrs. Huet rushed off to the kitchen to make tea, calling out, "Just wait a minute. I'll make some tea, and then we can chat before we head out." But Mrs. Vun waved her off. "No need. Let's go early before it starts raining." Still, Mrs. Huet didn't hear her and continued to make tea. Left alone in the living room, Mrs. Vun began to inspect the room more closely. Recently, she had discovered she possessed a strange ability to see and communicate with things from the invisible world that others couldn't see. As if guided by some invisible force, like she was in a trance, Mrs. Vaughn stood up and wandered around the room, examining the odd items Hong had collected. She stopped in front of the mannequin head with the military cap and stared at it, frozen in place. She was about to turn away, but something pulled her back. Unable to resist, she stood there, staring at the head, mumbling something to herself, her words barely audible. At that moment, Mrs. Hui had just finished making tea and brought it over. Seeing her friend staring intently at the mannequin head, she couldn't hide her frustration and said, "Oh my gosh, that troublesome son of mine. This morning he brought that mannequin head home. Did you know? I was in the middle of my prayers and he threw it at me, told me to open it, nearly gave me a heart attack." Mrs. Hui sighed tiredly, clearly exasperated. She was almost 50, yet her son still hadn't shown any interest in starting a family. Instead, he was obsessed with collecting all these antique items, filling the house with clutter. But Mrs. Vaughn wasn't really paying attention to what Mrs. Hui was saying. She remained fixated on the mannequin head. Sensing this, Mrs. Hui poured tea and sat down beside her, ready to share something that had been bothering her. "Let me tell you something, Vaughn," she said, her tone serious and slightly mysterious. Noticing the change in mood, Mrs. Vaughn responded, "Go ahead, I'm listening. What's so important?" Mrs. Hui paused for a few seconds, then lowered her voice to just above a whisper. "I'm really fed up with my son. Every day he brings something new home. Just look over there." She pointed to the mannequin head on the shelf and continued, "Yesterday, while I was in the middle of my prayers, he came home and tossed that thing at me. I opened it, and there it was, staring at me with those wide, lifeless eyes, its mouth full of what looked like blood. I don't know if it was something stuck in it or what, but it scared the life out of me. I thought I was hallucinating." Hearing the story, Mrs. Vaughn could sense the fear in her friend's voice, imagining the terrifying scene. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and said, "You know, the moment I stepped into your house, I noticed that head right away. Even though it's just a replica, it almost feels real." Her words were cryptic, causing Mrs. Hui to jump in surprise. But as a spiritual person, Mrs. Vaughn didn't want to cause unnecessary worry or create bad karma, so she quickly changed the subject. "Oh, it's nothing really. It's just a toy. Let's go to the temple. It's getting late. The monk asked me to be there early for something." Mrs. Vaughn stood up, urging Mrs. Hui to hurry. As the two women left the house, they had no idea that Hong had been awake for a while, eavesdropping on their entire conversation. Being someone who didn't believe in superstitions, he just smiled to himself and thought, "These old women, scared of everything, making up crazy theories." Now about Hong's collection room. It was a massive bedroom, about 40 square meters. In a crowded city, that space could easily house 5 or 6 people. But for Hong, only a small corner was used for sleeping, as the rest of the room was filled with his collectibles. His bed was almost completely covered with various items. Tangled phone chargers, old iPads, broken TV remotes, even an air conditioner remote that hadn't worked in years. Everything lay scattered, and he never bothered to throw anything away. The most unique part of his collection, however, was the American military armor he had collected since 1968. Over the years, some pieces had been damaged, but Hong meticulously patched them up. Every now and then, he'd retreat to the corner of the room, gently touching and admiring these artifacts, as if they were treasured companions. In addition to the armor, Hong had collected canteens from both the French and American wars, all neatly arranged on a steel shelf. Despite being decades old, some even over 50 years, they were still in remarkable condition. Sometimes, Hong would take one of the canteens, fill it with water, and wear it on his belt as he went to work. Whenever he passed the hospital guards, they would stare, fascinated by the unique item. Their admiration only fueled his excitement. Among his collection, many items had dark, eerie histories tied to the previous owners, people who had passed away, many during the wars. And with such artifacts, it was inevitable that the majority of their former owners were long gone. Those who were still alive were likely near the end of their lives. Returning to the mannequin head, Hong took it out, deciding to give it a good cleaning. He spent time wiping the dust off with a damp cloth, and then carefully used a wide-toothed comb to smooth the hair. At first he thought the hair was just cheap synthetic fibers, but as he continued combing, a chill ran down his spine. The sensation was hard to describe, almost as if he were combing the hair of a real woman. In the old, damp room, an unexpected scent of bouquet herbal shampoo began to linger in the air. Hong paused, confused, raising the comb to inspect it closely, wondering if he was really combing the hair of a real person. He muttered to himself, "What the hell? I'm just overthinking. It's just a fake head. No real hair here." Hong chuckled to himself, then tied the mannequin's hair back with a rubber band. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the door creaking open, followed by footsteps. Thinking it was his mother returning from the temple, he didn't bother to turn around. But when he listened carefully, there was no reply. Annoyed, Hong stood up and shouted, "Are you deaf, Mom? Why aren't you answering?" He was used to speaking disrespectfully to his mother like this. But as soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and saw no one. The door was wide open, and beyond it was nothing but the pitch-black night. It was already 9 p.m., and his mother still hadn't returned. Feeling anxious, Hong began to wonder. Normally, the two of them would be home together, and their loud arguments had been disturbing the neighbors for years. He thought his mother had come back, but she hadn't. So who had opened the door? Could it be a ghost, he whispered to himself before quickly dismissing the thought. Am I starting to believe in superstitions like my old lady? Ghosts? What nonsense! Trying to shake off the thought, Hong hurried down the stairs, but as he ran, he clearly heard the sound of footsteps following him, accompanied by the clacking of high heels. Then, a young girl's voice echoed, "Wait for me, brother!" Hong froze and listened carefully to the sounds around him. But soon, everything fell silent, as if nothing had happened. He reassured himself, "Just my imagination. Lately, I've been feeling like someone's talking beside me, but when I check, no one's there." He tried to calm down, recalling what he had learned about auditory hallucinations, the sensation of hearing sounds that aren't really there, often associated with mental disorders like schizophrenia, severe depression, or substance abuse. Starting to worry, Hong grabbed some medical research papers to read up on psychological symptoms. However, nothing seemed to fit his condition. He wasn't depressed, and he certainly didn't have any signs of schizophrenia. But still, he had to find some explanation for what was happening. Hong waited another 10 minutes for his mother, but by 9:10 p.m., she still hadn't returned. Growing frustrated, he muttered under his breath, "Did she get caught up somewhere? It's late already." Finally, he got on his bike and sped off. His first stop was Mrs. Vun's house, hoping his mother might be there. When he arrived, he saw a few people standing outside looking concerned. Seeing Hong, Mr. Hung, Mrs. Vun's husband, hurried over and asked, "Have you seen my wife? Did she stop by your place?" Hong shook his head. "No, I was just about to ask. My mom left with her to the temple around 6 p.m., but they haven't come back." Mr. Hung nodded and said, "Let's go find them together." With that, he climbed onto Hong's bike, and the two of them sped off in search of their wives. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hui and Mrs. Vun had set off for the temple. Normally, the temple was only a few kilometers away. It seemed like they were driving forever without reaching their destination. The road felt endless, and at times it seemed like they were going in circles. When they reached the crossroads near the mango orchard, they were only about 100 meters from the temple gate. But instead of seeing the temple, they were staring at it. Sitting on the back of the bike, Mrs. Hui pointed at the cemetery and said, "You've taken a wrong turn, Vun. This is the cemetery, not the temple." Confused, Mrs. Vun signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. She replied, "Wait, I'm sure that's the cemetery. You must be mistaken." Hearing this, Mrs. Hui rubbed her eyes to get a clearer look. She insisted, "No, that's definitely the temple. You're the one who's confused." Frustrated, Mrs. Hui got off the bike and said, "Let me drive. Hold on tight." She quickly crossed the road and drove straight into what she believed to be the temple. But in Mrs. Vun's eyes, where they had just entered was still the cemetery. She kept rubbing her eyes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. As Mrs. Hui hurried inside, afraid of being late for the prayer session, Mrs. Vun pulled on her friend's sleeve and said, "No, I'm not going in. You go ahead. I swear this is a cemetery." Annoyed, Mrs. Hui turned back and snapped, "What's wrong with you? Look." She pointed ahead, where she saw the head monk slowly walking toward them. Mrs. Hui respectfully bowed her head, greeting the monk. But in Mrs. Vun's eyes, there was no monk. Instead, she saw a snake slithering toward them. Horrified, she ran off, thinking to herself, "It's Hui who's hallucinating, not me." I'll wait for you out on the road. Once you're done with your prayers, I'll be here to go home with you." Vun called out as she quickly made her way to the roadside, where she sat waiting for her friend to finish at the temple. The strangest scene unfolded just as Hong and Mr. Hung arrived at the temple to search for Mrs. Hui. They found Mrs. Vun sitting by the side of the road, near the path leading into the temple. She appeared dazed, as if she were in a trance, almost like she had been possessed. Seeing this, Mr. Hung immediately jumped off the bike and ran over to shake her shoulder. "Vun, what are you doing here? Where's Mrs. Hui?" Hearing her husband's familiar voice, Mrs. Vun seemed to snap out of her daze. She stood up suddenly, looking flustered. "Oh no, I told her I'd wait here while she finished her prayers. What time is it now? Why is the road so empty?" Feeling concerned, Hong hurried into the temple grounds to look for his mother. But when he arrived, he saw that the main hall was already locked up. The lights were gradually dimming, leaving only the flicker of the altar candle. He ran down to the kitchen area, but that too was closed and dark. Unable to find his mother, Hong rushed back to where Mr. Hung and Mrs. Vun were standing, asking in frustration, "Where's my mom? I can't find her anywhere. How did you two get separated?" Now fully alert, Mrs. Vaughn began to recount the strange story to the two men, one old and one young. "When we arrived at the temple, all I saw in front of us was a cemetery. I didn't want to go in, but Hui insisted that I was just seeing things and led me toward the monk. But the monk, he wasn't a monk. I saw a snake instead." Hong listened carefully, keeping calm, but Mr. Hung sighed and muttered under his breath. "I've told you before, you don't need to go to the temple so much. There are too many ghosts in temples these days. Buddha isn't in the temple. Buddha is in your heart." As he spoke, he thumped his chest with his finger, trying to make his point to his wife. Mrs. Vaughn, feeling slightly guilty, nodded, but Mr. Hung continued his scolding. "Haven't you seen it online? Plenty of people practice Buddhism at home, read scriptures at home, and they still connect with Buddha. There's no need to go to the temples, especially on a day like this during the Ghost Festival." Annoyed by her husband's words, Mrs. Vaughn shot him a glare and said, "If you keep talking like that, someone's going to be standing right behind you." Mr. Hung, a retired soldier who had fought in the war and even buried comrades with his own hands, wasn't afraid of ghosts. Irritated, he retorted, "Ghosts? You think I'm afraid of ghosts?" He didn't believe in the supernatural experiences his wife claimed to have had recently. But just as he finished speaking, he sensed something strange. Turning around, he saw the figure of a woman standing behind them. He didn't think it was a ghost though, just someone who happened to be passing by. He was about to call out to her, but before he could, Mrs. Vaughn rushed over and clamped a hand over his mouth, her voice trembling. "Let's go. It's late. We should leave." While Mr. Hung and Mrs. Vun were arguing, Hong quietly made his way around the back of the temple, where a narrow path led to the cemetery. This was the same cemetery that Mrs. Vun had seen earlier when they arrived at the temple. Hong walked slowly along the grass-covered path, through the rows of cold, silent graves, his instincts telling him that his mother was somewhere nearby. And he was right. In the distance, Hong spotted a familiar coat, his mother's. She was sitting beside a fresh grave, with newly placed flowers still adorning the site. On the gravestone was a picture of a young woman with long, flowing hair, smiling softly. As Hong stared at the photo, a chill ran down his spine. The hair in the picture looked eerily similar to the sensation he had felt when combing the mannequin head earlier that day. The woman in the photo seemed to be gazing directly at Hong, as if she had something to say. Could there be a connection between these two events? Why would his mother be sitting by this grave, nodding off beside the burial site of a young woman? The eerie coincidence made Hong start to believe, just a little, in the world of spirits. He had never fully dismissed the idea, but it always felt distant and unclear to him. He believed that the realms of the living and the dead were separate and should never cross paths. But tonight, he had brushed up against that boundary. "Meh! Mom!" Hong called out loudly, trying to snap his mother out of her trance. But Mrs. Hui remained silent, her hair loose around her face, her head resting beside the young woman's grave. She didn't respond to his shouts. Growing impatient, Hong walked over and in frustration tugged at the back of her hair, shouting, "Mom! Wake up!" His shout echoed through the dark, quiet cemetery. The sound jolted Mrs. Hui awake, her eyes wide as she looked around, shivering when she realized she was sitting in the middle of a graveyard. She saw Hong standing before her, his face full of concern, and asked in a dazed voice, How did I get here?" Seeing his mother in such a state, Hong's heart filled with sadness. He looked at her closely, realizing how much she had withered since his father passed away. As a doctor, Hong had cared for so many patients, yet he had been neglectful of his own mother's health. Perhaps she had turned to prayers in the temple to cope with the loneliness of old age, especially with him, already 50 years old and still unmarried. "Meh, stand up. Let me take you home," Hong said gently. Mrs. Hui, weak and drained of energy, allowed her son to help her up. Together, they left the cemetery. Outside the temple gates, Mr. Hung and Mrs. Van were already waiting. The four of them rode off into the quiet night, and it felt as though this night was something unusual, a time when the line between the living and the dead blurred. After that night, Mrs. Hui fell seriously ill. Her hair began falling out in clumps, and she became frightened of going to the temple, something she had done regularly for years. Even Mrs. Van, once a regular temple-goer, stopped visiting as often, only keeping in touch with Mrs. Hui by phone and telling each other to stay home until the 7th lunar month passed. As the days went by, Hong became increasingly obsessed with the mannequin head. His once monotonous, colorless life had taken on a strange new dimension since he brought it home. Every day, he would take it out, brushing its hair as if it were a precious treasure. Even at work, he found himself thinking about the mannequin head, imagining romantic stories between himself and the object. The line between reality and fantasy blurred more and more in Hong's mind. Every afternoon, after finishing his shift at the hospital, Hong would visit the old soldier, the man who had given him the mannequin head. The elderly man was a former soldier who had survived many brutal battles and now lived alone in a large, antique-filled house. The relationship between Hong and the old man had shifted from doctor and patient to something like close friends. Hong visited not just to check on the man's health, but also to indulge in his peculiar fascination with war memorabilia. In that ancient house, Hong was captivated by the old man's collection of war relics, helmets, rusty guns, faded photographs. These objects sparked memories of his nation's history and its battles for freedom. Today, as Hong arrived for his visit, the old man was lying on his bed looking pale. The old man smiled weakly at Hong. "So you've come, huh? It's been a while since I've seen you." The old man always referred to Hong as Thui, a title of respect for a doctor, because to him, Hong was a true healer. Hong smiled and responded, "I've been busy, but I made time to visit you today." As he spoke, Hong glanced around the room, then asked, "Have you found any new treasures?" The old man's eyes lit up. "Recently, I found a very special military helmet, made from leather. You can still see the wear from its time in battle." They continued to talk excitedly about the old man's collection, but suddenly the old man's voice grew softer, tinged with sadness. "Speaking of treasures, do you remember the mannequin head I gave you?" Hong nodded. "Of course, it's the one with the beautiful hair." The old man continued, "Yes, that hair, it's beautiful. But lately, I've been having strange dreams. In my dreams, a young woman comes to me, asking for her hair back. She says it's hers, and she needs it to move on." He looked at Hong, his eyes filled with confusion. "Isn't that strange?" A shiver ran down Hong's spine. He remembered the mannequin head with its long, glossy black hair, which he had admired so much, but now he felt something unsettling about it. He asked cautiously, "Do you know anything about the girl in your dreams?" The old man shook his head. "I don't know. She comes every night and says the same thing." Hong fell silent, deep in thought. He recalled a story his mother had told him. She once mentioned that in a village on the outskirts of the city, a young woman had been mysteriously murdered, and her hair had been cut off and never found. "Have you heard about this?" Hong asked, recounting his mother's story of the murdered girl. The old man's face turned pale. "I've heard that story." As Hong shared more details from his mother's tale, the old man's expression grew more serious. "Could it be," he murmured, "that the hair on the mannequin head belongs to that girl, and her soul is still attached to it?" Hong felt a chill run down his spine. He had never imagined that the gift he had received from the old man could be connected to such a dark and mysterious past. Meanwhile, back at home, Hong's mother, Mrs. Hui, was sitting in her room, chanting prayers as she did every night to bring peace and safety to the family. That evening, while Hong was working the night shift, Mrs. Hui was fingering her prayer beads when she noticed a shadowy figure standing by the doorway. It was a young woman, around 20 years old, with long, dark, greenish-black hair cascading down her shoulders. Her pale face and eyes filled with sadness and resentment stared directly at Mrs. Hui, as if piercing through her soul. A shiver ran down Mrs. Hui's spine. She had never seen a ghost so vividly before. The young woman slowly walked into the room, approaching her. Mrs. Hui tried to speak, but her throat felt tight and dry, as if something was choking her words. The young woman raised her hand and gently touched her own hair. It was at that moment that Mrs. Hui realized something horrifying. The girl's hair was identical to the hair on the mannequin head that Hong kept in his room. In a soft, icy voice, the girl asked, "Do you see me?" Mrs. Hui, trembling with fear, nodded. The girl continued, "My name is On. I was murdered and my hair was cut off. I cannot move on because it's still here in this world." At that moment, Mrs. Hui understood everything. The hair on the mannequin head belonged to Ong, and her spirit had been bound to it, preventing her from finding peace. Trying to stay calm, Mrs. Hui gently asked, "What do you want? How can I help you?" On replied, "I just want to be free. Please, I beg you, help me." Meanwhile, Hong's room continued to fill with old, eerie war relics, rusty guns, weathered helmets, and faded photographs. The room, with its dark atmosphere, had an unsettling air of antiquity and sorrow. Among all these items, a white porcelain vase sat on his desk, holding a gruesome secret, a human leg bone that Hong had kept from a surgery. Each night, after the house went quiet, Hong's room would come alive with strange noises. Soft footsteps gliding across the floor, whispers in his ear, and painful groans. At first, Hong thought it was just his exhaustion from the long days at work, but soon, he realized that something far more disturbing was happening. The eerie events became more frequent and intense. Hong began to see shadowy figures moving around his room. Sometimes, he could feel someone touching him or hear incomprehensible murmurs in his ear. One night, he woke up suddenly, his body freezing with fear as he felt a pair of eyes staring at him. When he opened his eyes, he saw a ghostly figure standing at the foot of his bed. The figure was tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered military uniform. Its face was hidden in darkness, except for its glowing red eyes. Hong tried to scream, but before he could, the ghost lunged at him, wrapping its cold hands around his throat. He struggled to break free, but he was too weak against the spirit's supernatural strength. As the choking sensation overwhelmed him, panic filled his mind. Suddenly, a bright light flooded the room, and the ghost let out a shriek of agony before disappearing. Gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat, Hong lay there, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The next morning, Hong woke up with his throat still sore. He looked around his room, but there were no signs of the ghost from the night before. He dismissed it as just a nightmare, but when he looked at the porcelain vase on his desk, a wave of dread washed over him. He remembered the story that the old veteran had told him. When someone dies but their spirit lingers, they will always try to return to where they belong. Hong began to suspect that the human leg bone inside the vase was the reason for all the strange occurrences. Perhaps the ghost of the man to whom the bone belonged had returned, seeking the rest of his body. The nightmares continued to haunt Hong, always featuring the same young woman with long hair, her eyes filled with sorrow and resentment. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a soft whisper in his ear. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt impossibly heavy. The whisper grew louder, clearer. "Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you." The voice was gentle, completely different from the harsh, cold voice of the ghost that had attacked him before. Hong focused on the whisper and heard it again. "It's me, Ong. I know you're scared, but please don't be. I won't harm you." Startled, Hong remembered the story about Ong, the girl who had been murdered and lost her hair. Could this be the same girl in his dreams? "Why are you here?" Hong asked in his thoughts. "My hair? It's on the mannequin head in your room," Ong answered. "I've been trapped there, and I can't move on." Hong realized with horror that the hair on the mannequin head, the gift from the old man, actually belonged to Ong, the girl who had been killed. "I need your help," Ong pleaded. "Please, help me find peace." Despite knowing the danger, Hong agreed to help Ong. He couldn't ignore the suffering of a trapped soul. Over the next few days, Hong began researching spiritual rituals and exorcisms. He even reached out to people with psychic abilities for assistance. While Hong was working to free Ong, the spirit of the man from the vase began tormenting him relentlessly. The ghost tried to stop him from helping Ong, but she always found ways to protect Hong from the malicious spirit's attacks. One night, while on duty at the hospital, Hong felt an overwhelming wave of drowsiness. Even after drinking coffee and an energy drink, he couldn't fight it and soon fell into a deep sleep. In his dream, Hong found himself back in his room, filled with the antique war relics he had collected. The figure of a man with a missing leg and tattoos covering his body appeared, gripping the long, silky hair of a young woman. The man yanked her hair with rough hands and slammed her head against the bed frame repeatedly, blood splattering everywhere. Horrified, Hong tried to rush in and stop him, but he realized he was powerless, like a ghostly figure himself, small and insignificant. The closer he tried to get, the more the man pushed him back with a terrifying strength. "You dare protect her? I'll kill her!" The man's voice, filled with hatred, boomed. Hong felt trapped in a world between reality and dreams, unable to escape. In desperation, he screamed, "You're all crazy! I'm the only one still alive here. You're both just ghosts. What's the point of killing anymore?" His scream echoed throughout the room. The man with his shadowy face seemed to snap out of a trance. He released his grip on the woman's hair and both spirits faded away. Hong let out a sigh of relief, but before he could fully recover, a nurse burst into the room, shaking him awake. "Dr. Hong, wake up! Your mother is in the ER!" she yelled. Hong jolted awake, his head throbbing with pain. He rubbed his eyes, trying to determine if he was still dreaming. In front of him was Nurse Fung, her swollen, infected lips from a recent tattoo job looking painfully irritated. "Come on, hurry! Your mom is downstairs in the ER," she urged. Hong splashed cold water on his face to wake up fully, then sprinted to the emergency room. When he arrived, he saw two doctors checking his mother's blood pressure and heart rate. Hong rushed to her side, placing a hand on her forehead. She seemed perfectly fine. No fever, her heart rate normal. He turned to the doctors, confused. "What's going on? Why is she here?" One of the young doctors explained. Her blood pressure shot up to 180 earlier. Mrs. Huit, her voice trembling, muttered, "I don't know what happened. Suddenly my face felt hot and I heard someone cursing in my ear. I got scared, so I came to the hospital." Hong listened, the events from his dream flashing through his mind. Everything started to connect. The voices, the attacks. It was clear to him now, someone or something was trying to torment him. But how could he fight an enemy that he couldn't touch or see? The question gnawed at him, but he couldn't tell anyone about the invisible forces haunting him. After his mother was admitted to the hospital, Hong walked around like a man possessed. Seeing her, once a strong and tireless woman, now so fragile and lying in a hospital bed, made him realize how fragile life was. No matter how strong someone might seem, time and the inevitability of life's end were unstoppable. In the days that followed, Hong spent most of his time in his room, sitting in front of the white porcelain vase that he had once cherished so much. He would sit for hours, staring at it, reflecting on all the strange things that had happened. The more he looked at it, the more fear and regret filled his heart. Slowly, Hong began to believe in the spiritual world he once dismissed as far-fetched. He remembered the nights of nightmares, the shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, and the haunting cries of pain. He looked around his room at all the items he had collected over the years. Old guns, weathered helmets, and faded photos. Each item held its own story, its own soul. And Hong finally understood that he had unknowingly taken possession of things that didn't belong to him. Those souls, tied to their objects, longed to return to where they belonged. For the first time, Hong felt genuine remorse for his actions. He decided it was time to return the porcelain vase to where it belonged and grant the spirit within it peace. One day, he took the vase to the cemetery, choosing a quiet, secluded spot. He dug a small hole, placed the vase inside, and before covering it, he whispered a heartfelt apology. "I'm sorry, I've troubled you for far too long. I won't do it again. Rest in peace." Throughout his life, Hong had always done strange things, perhaps to prove to the world that he was strong and different. But now, he realized there were things he couldn't control, forces from the spiritual world that he had no business interfering with. Hong's perceived strength, in the end, wasn't true strength at all. Instead, it had caused pain and suffering for the spirits connected to the objects he had collected. How could anyone in their right mind take a human leg bone, polish it as if it were an object, and use it to hold flowers for display? It was a grotesque beauty born from the decay of human remains. Looking back at his foolish actions, Hong realized how naive and careless he had been. After burying the porcelain vase, a wave of relief washed over him. He returned home and immediately began cleaning out his room. Hong decided it was time to give away his collection of antiques to those who were meant to have them. He understood that holding on to objects with negative energy would only bring more misfortune to him and his family. He remembered the sleepless nights, the terrifying nightmares, and how reckless he had been in bringing those items home. By giving them to people who could appreciate them, Hong believed that the objects would finally find peace, and in turn, free him from the haunting that had plagued him. But what about the mannequin head? Hong still didn't know how to help the spirit of the young woman trapped within it. The mannequin head sat silently on his desk, its lifeless glass eyes seeming to follow his every move. Every night, as the house grew quiet, Hong would hear strange whispers coming from the head. The whispers were faint, barely audible, but enough to send shivers down his spine. The nightmares of the young woman, with her long, flowing hair and tear-filled eyes, continued to haunt him. Determined to uncover the truth, Hong began researching the history of haunted dolls and mannequins. He scoured old library books, reading about eerie stories of haunted objects. Some believed that dolls, especially those that were abandoned or mistreated, could become vessels for restless spirits. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. Hong soon realized that the mannequin head in his possession wasn't just a decorative piece. It was a vessel for the tortured soul of the young woman. He had unknowingly brought her into his home, opening a gateway to a mysterious and frightening spiritual realm. Seeking guidance, Hong confided in his mother, Mrs. Hui. Ever since the strange events began, Hong had undergone a significant transformation. He was no longer the brash, arrogant man he used to be. He had cut his long hair and trimmed his wild beard, shedding the eccentric image he once embraced. He was now trying to live harmoniously with others. After listening to Hong's story, Mrs. Hui was astonished and said, "You did the right thing. You've realized your mistakes and are trying to make amends, which is good. But to help the young woman's spirit find peace, you need to learn more about her. Go to the temple, ask the monks to perform a ceremony to help her soul pass on." Taking his mother's advice, Hong visited the temple to pray for the young woman's soul. He also sought out the elders in the village, hoping to uncover more about her story. The more he investigated, the clearer the picture became. The girl's name was On, a beautiful young woman with long, shiny hair. She had grown up in a poor family, and after her parents passed away, she had been forced to fend for herself from a young age. The villagers spoke of Oan as a kind and hard-working girl, always willing to help those around her. Despite her efforts to support herself and others, fate had been cruel to her. One night, while returning home from work late, Oan was attacked and brutally murdered by a group of young men. Her death shocked the entire village, but the killers were never brought to justice. The more Hong learned, the more sorrow he felt for Oan. She was an innocent spirit trapped between worlds, and somehow, Hong had unknowingly carried her soul back to his home. He now knew it was his responsibility to help her find peace, to free her from the limbo she was trapped in. Hong imagined On as a young woman full of dreams and aspirations, but life had dealt her a cruel hand. Her death left a lasting pain for those who cared about her. But what amazed him most was that, despite the injustice of her death, Oan's spirit remained kind and protective. She had been watching over him, shielding him from other vengeful spirits. Owen had even endured an attack from the malevolent spirit residing in the porcelain vase during one of Hong's dreams, yet she had continued to protect him. On the night of the full moon in the 7th month, the sky was overcast, with a thick fog rolling in, and the wind howled through the streets, creating eerie sounds. Inside Hong's old, creaky house, the atmosphere grew heavy and unnervingly still. Mrs. Hui, standing in front of a simple altar, was preparing for a special ritual. On the altar, incense smoke curled upward from a bowl, and beside it lay a sharp pair of scissors and 3 incense sticks. Mrs. Hui had a plan to help the young woman's spirit finally find peace. Mrs. Hui's eyes were fixed on the mannequin head sitting on Hong's desk. The long, silky hair of the young girl remained intact. With steady hands, she lit 3 incense sticks, and the smoke spiraled upward, blending with the mist outside. Closing her eyes, she offered a heartfelt prayer. "I humbly bow to the spirits. On behalf of my son, I perform this ritual. I will cut off this hair and return it to its rightful owner. Please witness and bless this act." When her prayer was finished, she opened her eyes, picked up the scissors, and began cutting the strands of hair, one lock at a time. With each snip of the scissors, she whispered a mantra. Outside, rain began to fall, the gentle tapping of raindrops on the window adding a calming rhythm to the room. Inside, the only sounds were the soft snipping of the scissors and the steady chanting of Mrs. Hui. Once all the hair had been cut, she carefully wrapped it in a white cloth. She stepped out into the misty night, guided by the faint light of the moon. Mrs. Hui made her way to a hidden corner of the cemetery, where a small grave she often visited lay. She dug a small hole beside the grave, placed the cloth bundle inside, and covered it with earth. Bowing her head, she prayed again. "I return this hair to its rightful owner. Please grant her peace and guide her soul to the afterlife." That night, Hong dreamed of the young girl with long flowing hair. In the dream, she smiled at him and said, "Thank you, and thank your mother." The next morning when Hong awoke, he felt a great weight lifted from his shoulders. He was sure that the young girl's spirit had finally found peace. From that day forward, the strange occurrences in Hong's home ceased. He and his mother lived a peaceful and happy life, frequently visiting the temple to offer prayers for the departed. One thing Hong couldn't deny was that everything in life is energy. Once his home had been cleansed and the negative energy removed, good fortune seemed to follow. Since clearing out his collection of old antique items, the house felt more open, fresh, and inviting. Hong's spirit lightened, and his temper became more even, no longer as short or fiery as before. His mother's health improved as well. The aches and pains that he had once dismissed as old-age complaints vanished. Now Hong leads a simple, humble life. He no longer obsesses over collecting antiques, instead focusing his time on his family and the people around him. He has come to understand that life is short, and the most important thing is to live a life of meaning. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this story. If you find it interesting, please click like or leave a comment so that we can complete the next stories in the best way. Please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications from us as soon as possible. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.